In this corner, we have Mortal Kombat, the top-selling Genesis game that kept all of the blood and guts from the arcade hit. In the other corner, we also have Mortal Kombat, the Super NES version that was heavily edited to make it safe for all ages. This was one of the biggest gaming events of 1993, forcing gamers to make that hard decision between better graphics or uncensored gore. But what did the critics say 32 years ago? We know that the Genesis version definitely sold better, but did the critics prefer it over the Super Nintendo? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Game Informer, and more classic magazines that reviewed both of these games when they first came out. Today we're going to see where the critics landed and maybe, just maybe, settle this Mortal Kombat debate once and for all in this blood and sweat-soaked episode of Magazine Matchup.
Right now, it costs up to $10 more to play certain games on Super Nintendo than to play the same games on Sega Genesis. Games like Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam, which is fine, if you don't mind being sucked dry.
Before we dive into the Mortal Kombat reviews, we first need to acknowledge the difference between the two versions. For those who didn't grow up in the early 1990s, it's important to realize that Nintendo had a family-friendly reputation that they desperately wanted to hold on to. With characters like Mario and Kirby, Nintendo had always been seen as safe, something that helped them dominate the 8-bit market in the 1980s. But this was the 1990s, and kids who grew up on the Nintendo Entertainment System were now looking for something a bit edgier. Enter Mortal Kombat, the arcade smash hit that had to be seen to be believed. With its over-the-top violence and gore, teenagers couldn't get enough of it, making a home console port a foregone conclusion. But what form would that port take? On the Genesis, gamers could punch in a code to activate all the blood and guts and fatalities that were seen in the arcade original. However, over on the Super Nintendo, things were a bit different. Nintendo would not budge when it came to the gruesome violence found in Mortal Kombat, forcing developers' sculptured software to make a lot of cuts. All the blood was replaced with what people affectionately called sweat, and many of the more brutal fatalities were changed to be a lot less gory. For example, Scorpion could still light his opponents on fire, but it definitely wasn't as clear what Kano was doing in his fatality. So, with this very clear distinction between the Genesis version and the censored game on the Super NES, we're now going to check in with 7 different magazines just to see what version they preferred. And we're going to start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, which reviewed both of these games in their 50th issue, the same issue where they reviewed Street Fighter II Turbo. When it comes to Mortal Kombat, neither of these versions even comes close to topping what Capcom was doing. But having said that, they still definitely had a preference. The Super NES version scored an average of 7.25 out of 10, with Martin pointing out Nintendo's questionable logic. Okay, Big N, let me get this straight. You think it's okay to beat someone up as long as they don't bleed? Some fatalities have even been toned down. Besides these little inconveniences, this is the best looking translation of Mortal Kombat. The graphics and digitized voices are virtually identical to the arcade. The gameplay is fun, but not Street Fighter II. When it comes to the Genesis version, EGM definitely preferred the blood and gore. They gave this port an average score of 8.25 out of 10, a full point higher than the Super NES. Hey, look, blood! Mortal Kombat remains faithful, having the arcade blood, but only with a code. I can live with that. This version is closer to the arcade in gameplay than the Super NES, but falls short in graphics and sounds, where some of the voices are missing. Playing with a 3-button controller is a pain, so buy a 6-button one. And with that, the Genesis has taken an early lead. EGM preferred the gore and gameplay to the sanitized sweat found in the Super NES. Let's see if GamePro agreed. Although GamePro targeted a slightly younger audience than EGM, they still spent a lot of time hyping up Mortal Kombat. For this matchup, let's again start with the Super NES version, which GamePro absolutely loved. Giving it a perfect 5 out of 5, they concluded that finally a game that could put other fighters out on the street. Despite some control issues and the altered fatality moves, Mortal Kombat on the Super NES is a great representation of the arcade classic and will more than satisfy most gamers. Alright, with a perfect score in the books, you might think that the Super NES version has this matchup in the bag. Well, not so fast, because GamePro also gave the Genesis version a perfect 5 out of 5. Genesis owners will be taunting Super NES owners with their cry of "no guts, no gory" when they get their hands on this brutal beat-em-up. Although the graphics don't quite live up to those on the Super NES, the great gameplay and better control combined with the special Mode A option make the Genesis card a winner. While it sure sounds like they prefer the Genesis version, we can only go based on the scores, and both games earned the same 5 out of 5. This means that we have a tie. Both games get a point. Next. If GamePro was going after the younger audience, then Electronic Games was doing the exact opposite. This was, after all, a resurrected version of the very first video game magazine, complete with some of the same editors, including the game doctor himself, Bill Kunkel. That's who ended up reviewing both the Genesis and Super NES version of Mortal Kombat. It is worth noting, though, that unlike most of the other magazines, Electronic Games decided to review the two games together in one long article, though still gave each version a different score. They concluded that the task of bringing a game as elephantine as this to even the 16-bit video game universe is enormous, and both Probe and Sculptured Software deserve major kudos for jobs exceedingly well done. As for Acclaim, the days are over when competitors could laugh that, while it always snatched up the best licenses, Acclaim never maximized their gaming potential. Mortal Kombat is a mortal lock to be among the best games produced on both the Genesis and Super NES in 1993. So then, which version did they prefer? With a narrow difference of only 4 points, the Super NES version takes the win as it picked up a score of 96%, while the Genesis port could only muster up a 92%. As the reviews said, they're both great scores, but the censored version takes the victory, and that ties the score up at 2 points each. Let's see who can break that tie and come out on top after a brief message from our sponsor.
Young Bobby Engels has a problem. He needs to earn the respect of his peers. So he gets Sega Genesis, the ultimate action system. And then he buys Mortal Kombat, the arcade edition, and the all-new Shinobi 3, and Marvel's X-Men. Now, things are pretty much okay.
I said chocolate chip. Say it. Say it.
If you're looking for the closest score that didn't result in a tie, then we have to go all the way to Australia and check in with Hyper's very first issue. When they reviewed the two versions, there was only a 1 point difference between the scores. They gave the Genesis version an 88%, noting that the sprites are a bit smaller than the Super NES and some backgrounds are not as spunky. They also liked the fast, smooth gameplay with the same feel and timing of the arcade, calling it a great conversion of the arcade game. The blood is an extra special bonus. Now, like I said, this is a squeaker, but this time around the Super NES was on the wrong side of the divide. Given the censored version, an 87%, they praised the faithful conversion of the arcade graphics, noting that it's brighter and with more depth than the Mega Drive. That said, they called the gameplay slightly sluggish and not quite as playable as the Genesis version. Nintendo were wimps for not allowing the blood. Thankfully, the game is good enough to do without it. While Hyper liked both, they ended up slightly preferring the Genesis version. That said, they didn't seem as annoyed at the lack of blood and gore as their American and European counterparts. I don't know, we can figure that out later, because right now, the Genesis version has a 1 point lead. Speaking of European magazines, it was another close call over at Computer and Video Games. When they reviewed the Genesis version, they gave it an impressive 90%, with Steve Keen raving that he enjoyed Mortal Kombat even more than the arcade. A better job of this on Mega Drive could not have been done. Special praise to Acclaim, who've gone with a violence option in the wake of the Night Trap farce. Great music, classic killer special moves, brilliant effects, and more options than an English football team manager could hope for. This is the most action-packed, responsive, and downright fun Mega Drive beat-em-up ever seen, and will quite possibly remain so for a very long time. I think we can all agree that 90% is an impressive score. But did the Super NES version do even better? No, it did not. In fact, it did 4 points worse, scoring an 86%. Impressed as I was with the Mega Drive version's graphics, nothing prepared me for these. Super NES Combat's graphics are almost arcade perfect. The characters are massive, superbly rendered, and excellently animated. Omitting the blood, though, was a major mistake. For me, the gory violence was the main attraction for the coin-op, and this version just doesn't have the same feel without it. At the end of the day, I'm sticking with the bloody, violent, and depraved Mega Drive version. You know, based on what CVG wrote about both games, I would have expected there to be a bigger divide between the two scores. Either way, the Genesis takes another round, giving it a 2-point lead over the Super Nintendo. And with only 2 more magazines to go, the best Nintendo can even hope for is a tie. It is worth mentioning that not all magazines were as quick to recommend both of these games. Die Hard Game Fan, for example, definitely liked one version of Mortal Kombat over the other. They gave the Genesis version an average score of 87%, with Kaylee calling it excellent. Acclaim has a winner on their hands with Mortal Kombat. Fans of the arcade should be happy with the Genesis version, as all the fatalities are here and there's some blood. This is one of the better arcade-to-home translations so far, and the special moves are very easy to pull off. Perhaps easier than the arcade. Buy it. Unfortunately, their tone wasn't nearly as positive and upbeat when they were talking about the Super NES version. They gave it an average score of just 77%, a 10-point drop from the Genesis version. Maybe this game should have been named Mortal Kombat because of all of the controversy regarding the fatality moves. The Super NES version is a good translation with great digitized graphics and almost all of the arcade voice. But the movement is kinda choppy and the primary reason you play the game in the arcade is gone. Look, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. Things are looking bad for the Super NES. I don't know, perhaps this is what you were expecting, but with the Genesis version taking a commanding 3-point lead, there's no way for the Super NES to catch up. Let's go ahead and see if Game Informer lessens the bleeding or just makes the injury worse. I won't keep you in suspense. Game Informer is definitely here to make things worse for the Super NES. In fact, with the Genesis version earning a 9.25 out of 10 and the Super NES port getting a much lower 7.75 out of 10, this is easily the biggest spread between the two consoles. Let's just get the Super NES one out of the way. Paul, the pro player, gave the game a pitiful 6.25 and complained that this version went through the censors at Nintendo and lost some of what made it popular in the arcade. Sorry, no blood or fatalities. Even without, Mortal Kombat has smooth animation and arcade-like backgrounds. The voice samples make the whole graphic and sound package great. Regrettably, the play is a bit sluggish and control is tough. Special moves take too much time to execute. I think big fans of the arcade might be disappointed. Yeah, I think that's an understatement. When Andy, the game hombre, reviewed the Genesis version, he gave it a 9.25 out of 10 and exclaimed, "Blood, guts, and death! I love it!" The digitized characters look and move just like the arcade. Okay, maybe not the arcade, but it's close. I wish they had more digitized voices, but I'm not complaining. The control is excellent, but not quite like the arcade. Once you get used to the subtle changes, the game plays like a champ. While everybody may not be able to stomach it, Mortal Kombat has some great features that make it unique in the fighting genre. And there you have it. With a final score of 6-2, the Genesis version handily takes the victory. This really was a bloodbath. And to be honest, I knew so going in. I figured that maybe 1 or 2 magazines might be generous and give the game a tie, but I really doubted that any would actually prefer the Super NES version. As it turns out, Electronic Games was the only magazine to side with the Nintendo platform, even if it was only by a few percentage points. But don't worry, Nintendo fans, you eventually had the last laugh here. When Mortal Kombat 2 hit home consoles, Nintendo relented and allowed all the blood and gore. As a result, the critics ended up preferring that version of the game over the one they got on the Genesis. But hey, that's a story for another day. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should check out our magazine matchup playlist. We've already done Mario vs. Sonic, Virtua Cop vs. Time Crisis, and even which Aladdin game the critics preferred. Now, here's the question I have for you. Do you prefer Mortal Kombat on the Genesis or the Super NES? I mean, maybe you're one that prefers the graphics to the gore, or perhaps the fatalities make all the difference. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back later this week with a brand new Review Crew episode looking at some of the classic 16-bit horror games. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.